The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators whispering, reporters scribbling notes, and the occasional flash of a camera from a journalist trying to capture the moment. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted, eager to see how this unusual case would unfold. At the center of it all, presiding over the trial, was Judge Evelyn Carter, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with a reputation for being particularly unforgiving. She sat high above the courtroom, her sharp eyes scanning the defendant with an air of skepticism. Her black robe added to her imposing presence, and when she finally spoke, her voice was firm, laced with a tinge of condescension. "Mr. Daniel Harper," she began, peering down over her thin reading glasses, "you have chosen to represent yourself in this case. Grand theft auto and resisting arrest are serious charges. Are you absolutely sure you don't want a real attorney?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Some chuckled under their breath, others exchanged knowing glances. The prosecutor, William Grayson, a seasoned lawyer with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, smirked as he adjusted his tie. To him, this was just another open-and-shut case. Daniel, barely 18, stood up from the defendant's table. His ill-fitting suit, a hand-me-down from his older brother, sagged at the shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at the judge, "I understand the gravity of this situation. I've reviewed the evidence, and I am confident in my ability to defend myself." A few people in the gallery chuckled again. The judge arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Confidence is one thing, Mr. Harper. Competence is another. Let's see how far your self-taught legal skills take you." With that, the trial began. The courtroom itself was a grand, old-fashioned space, oak-paneled walls, towering bookshelves filled with legal volumes, and an American flag standing proudly beside the judge's bench. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a stark glow on the proceedings. The air smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a scent familiar to those who had spent long hours in courthouses. As the prosecution prepared to present its case, Daniel glanced toward the jury. 12 men and women, a mix of middle-aged professionals and retirees, sat stiffly in their chairs, their expressions varying from skepticism to mild curiosity. To them, he was just another reckless kid who had gotten himself into trouble. But Daniel wasn't about to let them write him off so easily. The gavel struck, and the prosecutor rose to speak. The trial had officially begun, and every person in that room could sense it. This wasn't going to be as simple as they had thought. From the moment Daniel Harper stepped into the courtroom, it was clear that no one expected much from him. He was just a skinny teenager, drowning in a second-hand suit that didn't quite fit, shoulders too broad, sleeves too long. His nervous hands fidgeted with the cuffs as he stood before the judge, surrounded by experienced legal professionals who had spent years in this very room. Judge Evelyn Carter, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach, peered at him over her reading glasses, her lips curling into the faintest smirk. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "You've chosen to represent yourself. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer a real attorney?" A few people in the gallery chuckled. Even the bailiff let out a quiet scoff. The prosecutor, William Grayson, didn't even bother to hide his smirk. He had faced seasoned defense attorneys who struggled to win against him. What chance did a scrawny 18-year-old have? Grayson adjusted his tie, turning slightly toward the jury as he spoke. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to present its case. This should be fairly straightforward." More murmurs rippled through the spectators. To them, this trial wasn't about justice, it was a foregone conclusion. They expected a quick conviction, a lesson in humility for a kid who thought he could outsmart the system. But Daniel wasn't rattled. Though his hands trembled slightly, his voice was steady. "I understand the seriousness of the charges, Your Honor. I've reviewed the evidence, and I'm prepared to defend myself." The room grew quiet for a moment. The judge arched an eyebrow, slightly intrigued, but her skepticism remained. "Confidence is one thing, Mr. Harper. Competence is another." Another chuckle from the gallery. Another dismissive glance from the jury. No one believed he had a chance. But that was their mistake. The prosecution's case seemed airtight until Daniel Harper began his cross-examination. Officer Mark Daniels, a burly man with years on the force, sat confidently on the witness stand. He had testified that he caught Daniel in the act of hot-wiring a stolen car. His voice was steady, his words clear. To most in the room, his testimony sounded conclusive. But Daniel had been studying this case for weeks. He wasn't about to let vague assumptions stand as facts. When it was his turn, Daniel stood, his nerves fading into a quiet determination. He walked to the podium, adjusting his tie, then looked Officer Daniels directly in the eye. "Officer, you testified that you saw me attempting to hotwire the vehicle. Can you describe exactly what you saw?" Daniels hesitated slightly but then answered, "I saw you leaning into the driver's side window, fumbling with the wires." Daniel nodded. "And how far away were you when you made this observation?" "About 20 feet, Daniels replied. Daniel paused, letting the numbers settle in the minds of the jury. Then, he walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph, the interior of the car. "Officer," Daniel said, stepping closer, "can you point out where the ignition wires are located?" Daniel studied the image, then frowned. "Inside the dashboard," he admitted. Daniel turned to the jury. "So, these wires are inside the dashboard. Not hanging loose, not exposed." "Officer Daniels, you were 20 feet away, in the dark. How could you have seen me fumbling with wires through a closed window?" The courtroom fell silent. A few jurors exchanged glances. Even Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, now paying closer attention. The prosecutor jumped up. "Objection, speculation." But before the judge could respond, Daniel calmly countered, "Your Honor, if the prosecution's key witness claims to have seen something that was physically impossible, doesn't that cast doubt on their entire case?" The judge's smirk was gone. "Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Harper." The case was beginning to unravel. For most of the trial, the prosecution had insisted that Daniel Harper had stolen the car. The owner, Margaret Thompson, had testified with confidence, saying that she woke up one morning to find her black sedan missing from her driveway. To her, and to everyone listening, it was a straightforward case of grand theft auto. But Daniel had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He knew there was more to the story. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Daniel approached the witness stand with quiet confidence. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "you testified that your car was stolen during the night. Did you see anyone take it?" She hesitated. "No, I was asleep." Daniel nodded. "When the police recovered the vehicle, was there any damage? Broken windows, forced locks?" Mrs. Thompson frowned. "No, the car was intact." Daniel turned to the jury. "So, the car was stolen, without any sign of forced entry?" He paused, letting the thought settle before turning back to the witness. "Mrs. Thompson, how many people have access to your car keys?" "Just me and my husband," she replied. Daniel glanced at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness, James Thompson." The prosecutor immediately objected. "Your Honor, this witness was not disclosed." Judge Carter, now more intrigued than dismissive, held up a hand. "Overruled. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Harper." James Thompson, a middle-aged man with a nervous demeanor, took the stand. "Mr. Thompson," Daniel asked, "did you lend your car to anyone that night?" Mr. Thompson swallowed hard. I let my nephew borrow it. He needed it for a date. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Daniel turned back to the jury. So, the car wasn't stolen at all. It was borrowed, with permission. Yet, the prosecution has built its entire case on the assumption that I committed grand theft auto. The cracks in the case were becoming impossible to ignore. The prosecution's strongest piece of evidence was a grainy security camera video. According to Detective Harris, the footage clearly showed Daniel Harper entering the car on the night in question. To the jury, it seemed like the final nail in the coffin, a visual confirmation of the crime. But Daniel wasn't intimidated. He had studied that video countless times, and he knew exactly how to dismantle it. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he stood up, straightened his tie, and addressed the detective. Detective Harris, you testified that the security footage shows me entering the vehicle. Can you describe exactly what the video captures? Harris nodded. It shows a figure approaching the car, opening the driver's side door, and getting inside. Daniel paused, then asked, "Does the footage clearly show my face?" Harris hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "No, the video is grainy, and the lighting isn't great." Daniel took a deep breath and turned toward the jury. "So, to be clear, the footage does not provide a clear facial identification of the person entering the car?" The detective sighed. "That's correct." Daniel walked to the evidence table and picked up a printed still image from the footage. He held it up for the jury to see. "Detective, in your professional opinion, can you say with absolute certainty that this person is me?" Harris looked at the image, then shook his head. "No, I can't say with certainty." Daniel let that answer settle in the air before continuing. "Did you investigate any other suspects before charging me?" Harris hesitated. "No, we focused on you based on the initial evidence." Daniel nodded, then turned to the jury. "The prosecution's most important piece of evidence, their strongest claim against me, does not actually prove I was the person in that car. Instead of investigating all possibilities, they assumed my guilt from the start." The tension in the courtroom shifted. The jury members exchanged glances. The prosecution's case wasn't looking so airtight anymore. Even as the grand theft auto charge crumbled, the prosecution clung to one last argument: Daniel Harper had fled from an officer. No matter what else had been revealed, they insisted that running from law enforcement proved guilt. Judge Evelyn Carter, who had become increasingly engaged in the trial, leaned forward. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice firm, "even if the theft charge is questionable, you still ran when an officer approached you. How do you explain that?" Daniel took a deep breath. This was the moment he had prepared for. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to call a witness, Alex Thompson." The prosecutor immediately shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense is introducing a new witness without prior notice." But Daniel stood his ground. "Your Honor, Alex Thompson's testimony is crucial to understanding the full context of what happened that night. The prosecution has had every opportunity to investigate this case properly. If they missed key details, that's not my fault." Judge Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Harper." Alex Thompson, a lanky teenager, took the stand, looking uncomfortable. "Alex," Daniel began, "on the night in question, did you borrow your uncle's car?" Alex nodded. "Yeah, I needed it for a date." "And what happened after your date?" "I parked it near my house and left it there, but when I came back later, it was gone. I thought maybe it got towed or something." Daniel turned back to the jury. "So the car wasn't stolen, it was left unattended." He faced Alex again. "Before you left, did you see anyone near the car?" Alex hesitated. "Yeah, there was this guy hanging around. He looked kinda sketchy. I didn't think much of it, but maybe he took it." Murmurs filled the courtroom. Daniel turned to Judge Carter. "Your Honor, this testimony proves that I wasn't the original suspect. And as for the resisting arrest charge, here's what really happened." He took a steadying breath. "When Officer Daniels approached me, he wasn't in uniform. He didn't identify himself. He didn't show a badge. It was dark, and I had just discovered a car sitting abandoned with the keys in the ignition. Then suddenly, a man started running toward me. I thought I was about to be robbed, or worse. That's why I ran." The courtroom fell silent. Daniel looked toward the jury. "I wasn't resisting arrest. I was trying to protect myself." For the first time, the prosecution had no immediate response. The courtroom was silent as Daniel Harper stood up for his final statement. The once smirking prosecutor now sat rigid in his chair. The judge, who had dismissed him at the start, now watched with genuine interest. And the jury, the 12 people who would decide his fate, leaned in slightly, waiting to hear what he had to say. Daniel took a deep breath. He had spent weeks preparing for this, but now, standing before the court, his words were no longer just part of a defense strategy. They were his truth. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "I never set out to break the law. I never stole a car, and I never resisted arrest. I was walking home when I saw a car, parked awkwardly, with the door open and the keys inside. I was trying to figure out if someone had left it there by mistake when suddenly, a man ran toward me. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't announce himself as an officer. He didn't show a badge. I thought I was in danger, so I ran. And for that, I was arrested." He let his words settle before continuing. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple, that I am just another reckless teenager trying to escape justice. But what we've uncovered here today tells a very different story. The car wasn't stolen, it was borrowed. The so-called eyewitness account? Impossible. The security footage? Inconclusive. And my so-called resistance was nothing more than a scared kid running from what he thought was a threat." Daniel turned to the jury. "I've spent weeks studying the law, not because I wanted to play lawyer, but because I had no other choice. If I had stayed silent, the system would have labeled me a criminal without a second thought. But I am not a thief. I am not a threat. I am someone who, like all of you, believes that justice should be based on truth, not assumptions." The courtroom remained still. Even the prosecutor had no quick rebuttal. Daniel took a final breath. "I trust you to see the truth. I trust you to do what is right." And with that, he sat down. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Spectators filled every seat, eager to hear the jury's decision. Some were reporters, notebooks open, ready to document what they had assumed would be a predictable outcome. Others were legal professionals, drawn in by the spectacle of an 18-year-old defending himself against felony charges. At the defense table, Daniel Harper sat with his hands clasped together, his knuckles white. He had done everything he could. Now, it was no longer in his hands. Judge Evelyn Carter entered, her black robe flowing as she took her seat. The gavel struck once, bringing tea. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The jury foreman, a serious-looking man in his late 50s, stood up and unfolded a slip of paper. He cleared his throat before reading aloud. "On the charge of grand theft auto, we find the defendant not guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the foreman wasn't due. "On the charge of resisting AR." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped in disbelief. Others cheered. A few shook their heads, stunned that a teenager had just dismantled the prosecution's case and walked free. Judge Carter banged her gavel. "Order in the court," she called, her voice sharp. When silence returned, she turned to Daniel. "Mr. Harper," she said, her tone softer than before, "you have been acquitted of all charges. You are free to go." Daniel stood on shaky legs. He wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded. As he turned to leave, the judge stopped him. "Wait, Mr. Harper." He turned back, surprised. She studied him for a moment before saying, "What you did here today was remarkable. I hope you consider pursuing a career in law. The justice system needs people like you." For the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll think about it." And as he walked out of the courtroom, the weight that had been crushing him for so long finally lifted. He had won. As the gavel struck, signaling the trial's conclusion, Daniel Harper stood in stunned silence. The jury had spoken, not guilty on all charges. The weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a mix of relief and disbelief. He had won. The courtroom was still buzzing with murmurs, reporters scribbling notes, spectators shaking their heads in amazement. But amid the commotion, one voice cut through. "Mr. Harper." Daniel turned back toward the bench. Judge Evelyn Carter, the same judge who had dismissed him at the start of the trial, was now looking at him with an expression that was no longer skeptical but thoughtful. "Before you leave," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "I want to say something." The room fell silent. Even the prosecutor, still reeling from his unexpected defeat, looked up. Judge Carter studied Daniel for a long moment before continuing. "What you did here today was remarkable. You were underestimated from the start. You faced an experienced prosecutor, legal experts, and a system designed to break people like you. And yet, you stood your ground. You studied the law. You prepared your case. You exposed flaws in the very system meant to uphold justice. That is no small feat." Daniel swallowed, unsure of what to say. The judge leaned forward slightly. "I have been on this bench for over 20 years. I have seen defendants try to talk their way out of trouble. I have seen lawyers twice your age struggle to put together a defense as clear and compelling as yours. And I have seen the law fail people who didn't have the resources to fight back." She paused. "We need more people like you in this profession." A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel's heart pounded. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying," Judge Carter interrupted, "you should think about law school. This system needs people who understand justice, not just as a concept, but as a responsibility." Daniel nodded slowly, her words settling deep within him. "I'll think about it, Your Honor." She gave him the faintest smile. "See that you do." And with that, she banged her gavel one last time. As Daniel Harper stepped out of the courthouse, the morning sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. The air was crisp, fresh, different, somehow. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. Reporters swarmed him the moment he exited, shouting questions, microphones thrust in his direction. "Daniel, how does it feel to win? What's next for you? Do you plan on becoming a lawyer?" He wasn't sure how to answer any of them. So, he just kept walking. A familiar voice called out behind him. "Daniel." He turned to see Alex Thompson, the very person who had unknowingly set this entire ordeal in motion. Alex looked sheepish, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "I just wanted to say," Alex hesitated. "I'm sorry. I had no idea this would happen." Daniel studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "It's not your fault. The system failed both of us." Alex exhaled, relief washing over his face. "So, what now?" Daniel looked up at the courthouse behind him, then out toward the city stretching ahead. For the first time in his life, he saw something more than just another struggle. He saw possibilities. "I think I'm going to law school," he said, the words surprising even himself. "If I can do this without a degree, imagine what I could do with one." Alex grinned. "Man, you're gonna change the world." Daniel laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Maybe. But for now, just standing here, knowing he had fought back and won, was enough." He took one last deep breath, savoring the moment. This wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of something new. Life often places us in situations where we are judged before we are truly seen. Daniel Harper walked into that courtroom as an underdog, dismissed, underestimated, and assumed guilty. But he refused to let the system define him. Instead, he armed himself with knowledge, determination, and an unwavering belief in the truth. This story reminds us that justice isn't always about who has the most power or experience. Sometimes, it's about the person who refuses to back down. It's about having the courage to stand up, even when the odds are stacked against you. For those of us who have lived long enough to see life's injustices, this lesson is especially powerful. We've seen how the world can be unfair, how people can be silenced simply because they lack resources or influence. But Daniel's story proves that persistence, preparation, and the truth can break through even the toughest barriers. No matter our age, we all have moments where we must fight for what is right, whether for ourselves, our families, or our communities. And like Daniel, we must remember, when armed with knowledge and integrity, we are never as powerless as others might think.